Take the exact same $10,000. Put it into the exact same 3 Fidelity index funds. Build the portfolio one way, and it hands you roughly $1,600 a month for the rest of your life. Build it a different way, and that same $10,000 balloons into something close to $610,000. Nothing about the funds changes. Only the recipe does. Alex wanted to know which recipe actually made sense for him. So he did something most people skip entirely. He picked 3 specific funds, then tested 2 opposite ways of combining them, and tracked what each version would actually be worth 30 years down the road. Before we get into it, if you're someone who actually wants to see the real math behind these decisions, instead of just another top 3 funds list, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep making these deep dive breakdowns, and it means more videos like this one land in your feed instead of getting buried. All right, let's get into the numbers. Here's the setup. A total market growth fund, a dividend-focused fund, and an international fund. Every serious portfolio needs those 3 jobs covered somehow, and this video walks through exactly why these 3 specific funds handle each job well, and more importantly, what happens when you shift the balance between them. One quick thing before diving in, none of these are actively managed funds. There's no person sitting behind a desk deciding which stocks to buy or sell that week. Each fund simply mirrors an index, holding whatever that index holds, in whatever proportion the index says to hold it. That's the entire reason the fees on these stay so low, and it's a big part of why index investing tends to outperform actively managed alternatives once you zoom out far enough. Study after study shows the same pattern. Most professionally managed funds fail to beat their benchmark over a 10 or 20-year window once fees are factored in. So starting with index funds isn't a beginner's shortcut for a multi-decade holding period. It's often the mathematically stronger option, regardless of experience level. There's a second reason index funds make sense as a foundation, and it has nothing to do with fees. A single stock can go to zero. A single sector can fall out of favor for a decade, but an index made up of hundreds or thousands of companies essentially bets on the broader economy continuing to function and grow over time, a much lower bar to clear than picking the handful of individual winners correctly, year after year, decade after decade. Alex wasn't trying to find the next breakout stock. He was trying to build something durable enough to still make sense 30 years from now, regardless of which individual companies happen to be leading the market at any given moment along the way. The growth piece. FSPGX. Let's start with the fund doing the heaviest lifting on growth. FSPGX, Fidelity's Large Cap Growth Index Fund. This one tracks big U.S. companies specifically chosen for rapid earnings expansion rather than dividend payouts. Names like Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon sit near the top of the holdings list, each reinvesting the bulk of its profit back into the business instead of mailing checks to shareholders. The numbers here tell the story clearly. FSPGX carries a thin 0.5% dividend yield, almost nothing, but delivers annual share price appreciation of roughly 16.9%, the strongest of any fund in this comparison. This is the fund that does almost none of the paying you work and almost all of the growing the pile work. It helps to understand why a fund can behave this way at all. When a company like Nvidia generates a large profit, it has a choice. Send some of that profit back to shareholders as a dividend, or reinvest it into research, expansion, and new products in hopes of generating an even larger profit next year. Growth-oriented companies overwhelmingly choose the second path, which is exactly why FSPGX's dividend yield stays so low. The underlying companies are deliberately choosing not to pay much out. The bet embedded in this fund is that reinvested capital, compounding inside the business itself, will ultimately outpace whatever a shareholder could have earned by receiving that cash directly and reinvesting it manually. The income piece, FDVV, is the fund built specifically to generate cash. FDVV, the Fidelity High Dividend ETF. It holds large and mid-cap U.S. companies that not only pay dividends today, but have a track record of raising those payouts year after year. Here's what surprises a lot of first-time viewers. The top holdings in FDVV look almost identical to FSPGX. Apple, Microsoft, Broadcom, Nvidia, same companies, completely different reason for owning them. FSPGX wants their growth. FDVV wants their cash flow. And it turns out today's biggest tech companies generate enough profit that even a modest dividend policy translates into serious money. Apple alone returned more than $15 billion to shareholders last year through dividends. For anyone unfamiliar with the mechanics, a dividend is simply a portion of a company's profit paid directly to whoever owns the stock, usually distributed every quarter. Own more shares? Collect a bigger payment. That's the whole concept. FDVV runs a 2.9% dividend yield, a 5-year dividend growth rate of 11.2%, and annual price appreciation around 9.3%. Compare that to FSPGX's numbers, and you can already sense the trade-off forming. FDVV gives up a big chunk of raw growth in exchange for real, spendable income arriving today rather than decades from now. This trade-off is really the entire tension running through the whole video, just expressed at the level of a single fund. FSPGX bets that letting companies keep and reinvest their profit produces a bigger number eventually. FDVV bets that receiving a smaller, steadier stream of cash along the way is worth more to certain investors than waiting for a theoretically larger payoff at some unspecified future date. Neither bet is wrong. They're simply optimized for different outcomes, and understanding that difference at the single fund level makes the two full portfolio versions later in this video much easier to follow. The global piece. The third fund rounds out the portfolio with something neither of the first two funds offers exposure outside the United States. F6, the Fidelity International Index Fund, tracks developed market companies across Europe, Japan, the UK, and beyond. Think Nestle, Toyota, ASML, and Roche, businesses most American investors rarely think about, despite their size. Alex almost left this fund out entirely. International markets have trailed the US for the better part of 15 years, so on the surface, adding it looks like intentionally choosing the weaker performer. But that framing misses the actual purpose. A portfolio built entirely around one country's stock market is a bet, sometimes a very good one, but still a concentrated bet on that single country continuing to outperform everywhere else indefinitely. FSPSX exists to make sure Alex's entire financial future doesn't hinge on that one assumption holding true forever. And there's a detail buried in FSPSX's numbers that rarely gets mentioned. It carries a 2.6% dividend yield, 6.1% annual appreciation, and this is the surprising part, a 5-year dividend growth rate of 14.8%, higher than either of the other two funds. The fund most people treat as an afterthought is quietly the fastest growing income source of the three. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs against almost everyone's intuition. The natural assumption is that the fund with the worst recent performance must also be the weakest fund across every metric. But performance and growth rate aren't the same measurement. A company can be a laggard in share price while still steadily raising what it pays shareholders every year, and across an international index made up of thousands of companies doing exactly that simultaneously. The compounding effect on income, specifically, can end up outpacing funds that looked far more impressive on a stock chart. Why weighting matters more than fund selection choosing these three funds is really only step one. Step two, how much of the $10,000 goes into each one, turns out to matter just as much, arguably more. The same three ingredients can produce two dramatically different outcomes depending purely on proportion, the same way flour, butter, and sugar can become either a cookie or a cake, depending on the ratio. Alex decided to build both versions, side by side, and see exactly how far apart the outcomes would land. This is also where most beginner investing content quietly stops short. Plenty of videos will tell you which 3 or 4 funds to buy. Very few walk through what happens when you actually change the ratio between them, because the math takes longer to explain and doesn't compress into a simple checklist. But the ratio is arguably the more important decision of the two. Picking good funds is necessary. Picking the right proportion of those funds for your specific timeline and goals is what actually determines whether the portfolio does what you need it to do. Version 1. Built to pay Alex the income-focused, build weights the 3 funds like this. 40% into FSPSX, the International Fund. 35% into FDVV, the Dividend Fund. 25% into FSPGX, the Growth Fund. The International Fund getting the largest single slice tends to surprise people, but remember its dividend growth rate at 14.8%. It's the fastest compounding income source available here, even though its starting yield isn't the biggest. Over 3 decades, that growth rate does more work than a marginally higher yield, with slower growth, ever could. FDVV takes the second largest share because it's the fund delivering meaningful cash right now. This year, not eventually, and FSPGX drops to a supporting role at 25%, this build isn't optimized to maximize the ending balance, so growth becomes a background contributor rather than the headline. Worth noting, even with 40% sitting in the international fund, the US-based portion of this portfolio FDVV plus FSPGX combined still adds up to 60%. This isn't Alex turning his back on American companies. It's Alex balancing the country he lives in against the rest of the world, while letting the international fund carry more of the income growth workload than people typically expect. Blend these three weights together and you get a portfolio yielding roughly 2.2%, with a blended dividend growth rate of 11.9% and blended annual appreciation of 9.1%. One thing worth clarifying here, since the term comes up constantly in portfolio construction, blended doesn't mean averaging the three numbers equally. It means weighting each fund's number by how much of the actual portfolio it represents. A fund making up 40% of the account has nearly twice the influence on the blended figure as a fund making up 25%. That's a small mathematical detail, but it's the reason the blended yield and growth rate here land closer to FSPSX's and FDVV's individual numbers than to FSGX's, since those two funds together make up the larger share of this particular build. Here's the trajectory. Year 1, $10,000 becomes about $11,150. Year 10, roughly $28,900. Year 20, approximately $92,400. Year 30, close to $352,700. But again, the account balance isn't really the point of this version. The point is the check. By year 30, this portfolio is projected to distribute around $1,612 a month, indefinitely about $19,344 a year, arriving whether the broader market that year was strong, weak, or flat. Break down the $342,700 in total growth, and roughly $211.00 comes from the underlying share prices simply rising over time. The remaining $131,700 comes from dividends being reinvested rather than withdrawn each payout buying more shares. Those new shares generating their own payouts, compounding on top of compounding across 3 decades. That reinvestment engine ends up responsible for close to 38% of this portfolio's entire growth. Roughly 4 out of every $10 gained comes directly from the income side, working quietly in the background. It's genuinely easy to underestimate how much that reinvestment engine contributes, precisely because nothing about it looks dramatic in any single year. A quarterly dividend buying a few extra shares doesn't feel like much of an event, but stretched across 30 years and dozens of quarterly payments, those small, unremarkable purchases compound into more than a third of the entire portfolio's total growth, a result that only becomes visible when you zoom all the way out to the full timeline, rather than checking the account every few months and wondering why nothing seems to be happening. Version 2. Built to grow as large as possible now, flip the weighting almost entirely. Version 2 puts 68% into FSPGX, the growth fund, 22% into FDVV, only 10% into FSPSX. FSPGX dominates here because its 16.9% appreciation rate is simply the strongest lever available, and this version exists purely to pull that lever as hard as possible. FDVV keeps a meaningful 22% stake, not for its yield, but because even a growth-focused portfolio benefits from some dividend cushioning during rough years. FSPSX shrinks to a token 10%, present mainly as a hedge rather than a genuine contributor. Blended together, this version yields just 1.1%, with a blended dividend growth rate of 7.4% and blended annual appreciation of 14%. 3%, that last number, is where nearly all of this portfolio's story gets written. Here's the trajectory. Year 1, roughly $11,390. Year 10, about $37,600. Year 20, approximately $146,800. Year 30, close to $607,300. Notice how close year 1 looks to the income version $1,190 versus $11,150. The real separation doesn't show up for a decade or more, which is exactly why so many people underestimate how much the weighting decision actually matters early on. Of the $597,300 in total growth this version produces, roughly $584,900 comes from share price appreciation. Only about $12,400 comes from reinvested dividends. Nearly all the growth here is priced into the shares themselves, rather than paid out as cash, which sounds great. until you actually need to convert that number into spendable income. By year 30, this version distributes only about $87 a month, or roughly $1,044 across a full year. That's the real trade being made. An account nearly double the size, generating income nearly 20 times smaller. There's an emotional dimension to this trade-off that spreadsheets don't capture well. Watching an account balance climb steadily for 30 years feels satisfying in a way that's easy to underestimate, but it also means every dollar of that growth stays theoretical until the day shares actually get sold. For someone who genuinely won't need the money for decades, that's a non-issue. For someone counting on this account to eventually replace part of their paycheck, the gap between a large number on a screen and a reliable check arriving every month can matter far more than the size difference between the two portfolios suggests. The part most comparisons skip set both versions side by side. Same starting point, same 3 funds, same 30 years. Version 1, roughly $352,700 in the account, paying about $1,612 a month. Version 2, roughly $607,300 in the account, paying about $87 a month. Someone's already running a different calculation in their head right now. Apply the standard 4% withdrawal guideline to $607,300, and that's about $24,292 a year, roughly $2,024 a month, which is actually higher than version 1's dividend payout. So doesn't that make the growth-heavy portfolio the better income strategy after all? It's a fair question, and the math checks out on paper. But here's where paper and reality start to diverge. Version 1 never requires selling a single share. That $1,612 a month arrives purely from dividends. The account itself stays fully intact, indefinitely, regardless of what happens to share prices in any given year. Version 2 requires actively selling shares to generate that same withdrawal. And if the market happens to be down the specific year Alex needs that income, he's forced to sell shares at a depressed price just to cover ordinary living expenses, permanently locking in a loss instead of riding out the dip. That risk has a name, sequence of returns risk, and it's one of the main reasons a retiree with a technically larger account can still run into trouble faster than a retiree with a smaller income generating one. Neither version is objectively better. They're two different answers to two different questions. Someone decades from needing this money can absorb the growth version's volatility without much concern. Someone approaching the point where this account needs to start paying real bills is usually better served by the version built to pay, not just the version built to grow. Same $10,000, same 3 funds, the right answer. Depends entirely on when you actually plan to start living off it. It's also worth pointing out that this isn't necessarily a permanent one-time decision. A 25-year-old starting with the growth-heavy version isn't locked into that waiting forever. As retirement gets closer, that same person can gradually shift the ratio, trimming the growth fund, adding to the dividend and international funds, sliding from version 2 toward version 1 over time, instead of choosing one path at the very start and never revisiting it. The waiting is a lever, not a life sentence, and it's one worth reconsidering every few years as circumstances change. If you're curious what it takes to turn a starting balance like this into a full $1 million across different time horizons, that breakdown is coming up next. If this video helped you think about your own portfolio differently, that's exactly why I make these, so hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if you've got a specific fund combination you want me to run the real numbers on, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and the next video in this series might just be your idea.